Jekyll and Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson begins with two Victorian gentlemen, one of whom is our narrator, Utterson, and they're taking a stroll down a London street and discussing an incident that they recently heard about, in which a young girl was brutally trampled by this strange man called Hyde. Now, Utterson's incredibly interested in this because his friend, Dr. Jekyll, has recently made out his will to Mr. Hyde. Utterson pursues the case further and he goes to see a mutual friend of his and Jekyll's, Dr. Lanyon. Lanyon tells him that he's no longer friends with Jekyll, that they've had a falling out over some scientific experiments that Jekyll has been pursuing. Utterson becomes more and more obsessed by this idea of Mr. Hyde, and finally he manages to track him down. When he meets him, he's struck by a feeling of deformity, but not actually being able to see any specific thing that isn't quite right about Mr. Hyde. Utterson goes to see Dr. Jekyll, asks him about Hyde, but Jekyll assures him there's absolutely nothing to worry about. Everything with Hyde is fine. Everything with Hyde is fine until sometime soon after there's a murder, and Utterson is absolutely convinced that the murder was committed by Hyde. The description he's heard sounds like a man very much like Hyde. Convinced that Hyde is guilty, Utterson leads the police to Hyde's apartments, but he's not there. Utterson talks to Jekyll, and Jekyll assures him that he's absolutely broken with Hyde, that he's never going to see Hyde again, that Hyde is left. And to prove this, Jekyll shows Utterson a note, although it kind of seems that this note is in Jekyll's handwriting, not Hyde's. So Jekyll has promised that everything is going to be fine now, and for a while, Jekyll seems to be a lot better. He seems like his old self. He's quite chirpy, he's quite friendly. But then something changes and he becomes more gloomy, more reclusive. Then suddenly, Dr. Lanyon, their mutual friend, dies. And he dies from a shock that is somehow related to Jekyll, though we don't know what it is yet. Jekyll locks himself away in his laboratory for months. At last, Utterson manages to break in, and when he gets there, he finds Hyde dead on the floor in Dr. Jekyll's clothes, apparently a victim of suicide. At this point, Utterson has two letters. He has a letter from Dr. Lanyon, which said it was not to be opened until Jekyll's death, and he has a final letter from Jekyll. The letter from Lanyon explains the shock that he saw was seeing Jekyll physically transform into Mr. Hyde. When Utterson then reads the letter from Jekyll, it explains how he's been trying for years to separate the good and bad parts of himself. How he was hoping that by banishing Mr. Hyde, he could somehow find some peace, but that Mr. Hyde generally became more and more powerful. Jekyll could no longer control when he transformed or not. It closes in Jekyll's letter with Jekyll's assertion that Hyde is going to take over, that he will be Hyde forever, and that Hyde must now choose, will he die for the crime that he has committed, or will he take his own life? Dr. Jekyll is the epitome of the respectable Victorian gentleman. He's a physician, he's well-liked, and he's known for his good deeds in the community. Inside, though, he's plagued by these dark thoughts, these dark desires, and so he's committed to finding some way of separating the good side of himself from the bad. He really believes that every human being is made up of both good and evil. Of course, the flip side of Jekyll is Mr. Hyde, who for a lot of the novel we see acting independently, and of course first-time readers wouldn't know that Hyde and Jekyll were the same person. Hyde is brutal, he's savage, he's violent. He has no care for the consequences of his actions, even when those consequences directly relate to himself, as in when he murders. Never mind that that will ultimately see his own death if he's caught. Hyde is physically described as being almost deformed, almost not quite human, although there's no specific thing that people can see that is actually out of line. So this kind of suggests that there is a moral deformity rather than a physical one. Utterson, like Jekyll, is an upstanding member of the community. He's a lawyer, he's well respected, he's quite grumpy and he's not particularly sociable, but he has his ways and he has his few friends that he socializes with. Now, like Jekyll, there's a bit of a dark side to Utterson, but for Utterson, it's this morbid curiosity that he has. And Stevenson really riffs on this a little bit. When Utterson is first talking with his friend about the case with Mr. Hyde, they both say they're not really interested and they don't gossip. But then straight away, they're interested again. They're asking more questions. When Utterson first hears that Jekyll might have been involved in something sinister, he decides not to pursue it further. He thinks, no, he will respect his friend's reputation. So in that sense, we can see that Utterson is very much part of the Victorian community that is suppressing everything and creating this very repressed individual identity. Jekyll and Hyde is written during the Victorian era, and we're very familiar with the idea now that the Victorian era was a very repressive one. There were these ideas of how one was supposed to behave and think and feel, and that anyone who was acting in a different way was somehow deviant, and that all of these things ought to be repressed. Obviously, this leads to a very unhealthy lifestyle, and people would get very anxious about darker thoughts or deviant actions and deeds. As well as this, though, Victorian era is a time of extraordinary development, particularly scientific. A work that's particularly relevant to Jekyll and Hyde is Darwin's Descent of Man, which shows how humans actually evolved from essentially a kind of a monkey-like ancestor. Obviously, this caused a huge uproar at the time. People didn't like this at all. It kind of dethrones man's place of importance within the known world. If you look at Jekyll and Hyde, you'll see there are certain choices of word usage relating to Hyde that hark back to this idea of man descending from animals. So we have Hyde is described as ape-like and troglodytic. City life in the Victorian era was changing immensely, and this is an incredibly urban novel. There is no nature anywhere in here, except that once London is described as a field of lights, as if the sprawling mass of London is what we have instead of fields. Now, the cities were growing immensely during this time. Mostly this was from working class people coming to the cities in search of work. And what was happening was a kind of unenforced segregation, where we had very upper class areas and very working class areas, often right next to each other. The prejudice that goes along with this is that the upper class areas are respectable and the lower class areas are where sin is rampant. The idea that Jekyll and Hyde is playing on is that there are men from these respectable upper class areas who are going to the lower class areas in search of dark entertainments, to indulge these dark sides of themselves. One of the major themes of Jekyll and Hyde is this idea of inner darkness, that we all have a dark side to ourselves, and that this is something that we're always trying to conceal. Even the name of Hyde suggests concealment. Now, Jekyll proposes that we have a good side of ourselves and a bad side of ourselves. And he's playing with this idea of good and evil. And although the novel engages with this theme, it ultimately moves away from these as two separate absolutes. Because when Jekyll conducts his experiment, he doesn't get a good side and an evil side. He gets Hyde, but he finds that he himself is already the best version of himself that he can be. There is no easy angel to the human psyche. There is only the darkness that we all have within ourselves. The novel is very concerned with this idea of public appearances. If we all have this dark side within us, why don't we act upon it? Well, it's partly because we do find Hyde's behaviour repugnant, but it's also because we don't want to be seen to be acting badly. All of these characters have something within themselves that they don't want exposed. If it's Jekyll's dark feelings or Utterson's morbid curiosity, they still all want everybody to see them a certain way. So when Utterson believes that Hyde is blackmailing Jekyll, he doesn't look into it because his friend's reputation is more important than any moral misdeeds he might be involved in. So this is a time of great scientific development, There are lots of new ideas coming out and a lot of people arguing with what is being done, should it be done? So Jekyll, very much like other Gothic characters such as Victor Frankenstein, is a scientist pursuing a goal. He becomes obsessed with this idea, this one thing that he's really trying to do, which is to split the self into good and evil parts. He becomes so obsessed with it, he doesn't quite stop to think whether or not he should do it. And there's a criticism here, because Jekyll is working by himself. He's already received some very negative feedback from Dr. Lanyon, but he's not taking that into account and he's not working with other people. He's solely focused on this goal, and ultimately it leads him to a terrible place. His scientific pursuit leads him to a place where the only way for him to stop Hyde is literally to kill himself. It's interesting that the narrator of Jekyll and Hyde is neither Jekyll nor Hyde, but this man, Mr. Utterson. Now, this has a very interesting effect, because Utterson doesn't know anything about what is happening with Dr. Jekyll. So he's slowly learning it, picking up the clues as he goes along. And this allows the reader to follow along with Utterson, making this a sort of detective story. And it builds a great amount of tension as we see the different pieces of the puzzle and slowly slot them together. Stevenson also helps to build this tension by giving us tantalizing chapter titles, such as The Carew Murder Case and The Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon. These are signaling that something exciting is coming ahead and keep the reader going, building the pace and the suspense. Those who are familiar with the story of Jekyll and Hyde from movies or general popular culture might be really surprised on first opening this novel and getting this very quiet opening, these two respectable gentlemen just talking about things. It's quite a shock from what you might expect, and that's deliberate. This distinctly isn't one of the penny dreadfuls or the shilling shockers that were exciting, passionate stories of murder and violence. This book is respectable on the outside, but that means that when we get to Hyde's act of violence, and we're moving away from the quiet dialogue and the easy setting, getting to phrases like the bones audibly shattered, there are lots of auditory words and words creating imagery of the violence that he's committing. It's so much more powerful because we've had that very quiet beginning. And obviously this structure, this use of style, reflects the major theme of the book, that we have this nice, polite exterior, but inside there are lots of dark, frightening things happening.